Socialite is a work-in-progress detective game set in a dystopian social app. Your main objective is to look around for clues in order to fill up a journal that serves as the game progression. It's inspired by the likes of modern puzzle detective games such as Outer Wilds, Return of the Obra Dinn, The Case of the Golden Idol, and Chants of Sennaar, and also a few movies, shows and books. I'm Salex and I'm developing the game for PC and mobile. A new demo will be available in the upcoming month, so you can subscribe to the channel if you want to be updated with that. There's many ways to get clues in Socialite, and one of them is to chat with NPCs, the other citizens of this dystopian city. In this devlog, I'll explain how I created this feature. I started out with a very simple dialog option system. But a friend of mine who tried out the demo suggested the idea of making a little algorithm so you can write your own questions instead of having to choose between a bunch of options. I was at first a little reluctant as I'm still a coding beginner, but also it could end up taking an enormous amount of time just to feel like nothing more than a pretty but shallow feature. Then I realized it would actually sit perfectly well with the questioning part of an investigation, further putting the player in detective shoes. So the main drive behind this is absolutely not to remake ChatGPT or challenge the system with crazy questions. No, the challenge for the player will be to find the correct questions to ask in order to retrieve the clues they need. That idea makes it pretty easy for me actually. Technically, all I need to do is write all the answers a player can retrieve from a given NPC and the corresponding questions they would have to write to get those answers. I've divided these answers into three categories. First, the ones that directly feed the clues, the most important ones. Second category is more about context or character building. Like the app chatbot can talk to you about the perks of being a machine, for example. And finally, I wrote answers to any question that doesn't fall into the first categories, so the remaining infinity of questions a player can ask, and they will all be replied by a variant of "that's not relevant to me." Behind the curtain, it's basically just a dialog option system where you have to come up with the right questions. I've set up a couple more rules for it to work. There's a small number of characters you can type to limit the array of possibilities. Your message has to finish with a question mark, and if there's a swear word, the question disappears automatically. Hopefully, I will eventually deal with typos and synonyms, but for the sake of progressing into development, in this iteration the player has to write his questions with the exact wording and spelling to get his answers. That's it for the design part. Now let's look at the actual code. When the player writes a question and presses enter, my script converts the question into a text bubble and triggers a second function, the one that actually connects to the answers library. That's where I've stored all the questions for the relevant answers. In this section, for example, the player inquires about where they are. I figured the most common question would be "where are we?" and "where am I?" For Unity to understand the questions correctly, I've transformed them into regex, or regular expressions. Those regex essentially make sure the written question matches exactly what the program needs to receive, to avoid any confusion. For each of these questions, I've written multiple very similar answers to add some diversity to the conversation, so once the match is done, I trigger a random sentence amongst this pool of similar answers. Et voilà, the NPC gives his reply. I have to mention my main inspiration for this system, which is a 2016 French game called Event Zero. It features a much more advanced dialogue system, well depicted by Mark Brown in a GMTK video he made about it. Links is in the description down below if you're interested. On a totally different matter, I also created a little tool to generate a ton of NPC portraits quickly. The way I did it was inspired by one of my developing idols, Lucas Pope, for his indie debut, Papers, Please. I followed an incredibly simple route. I just drew multiple versions of face shapes, eyes, noses, mouth, torsos, hair, skin tones, glasses and beret. I can then generate each part randomly to assemble over 100,000 different faces. On the UI front, I started updating it a bit to make it nicer to look at. It's far from being done obviously, but here's what I worked on. I animated the text, gave some floating movement to the bubbles and icons, and started playing with post-processing. Finally, I added a shader transition to the mystery reveal, which brings us to the next devlog's topic, the journal. I'll explain how I'm organizing the investigation in a non-linear fashion to give as much agency as possible to all you detectives out there. In the meantime, I'll also be working on releasing the demo, so stay tuned for all that. Until then, see you guys!